It was July 30th, 2023, just weeks after the military coup in Niger. The army supporters gathered at the French embassy in Niamey, hundreds of them. They set fire to the embassy's door. They also burnt the French flag. Back in Paris, President Emmanuel Macron was spooked. He ordered a full evacuation. Around 600 French nationals lived in this country. All of them were pulled out. This military coup is definitely anti-democracy, but it's also anti-French. All symbols of France have been targeted, their embassy, their flag, and also their military base. But why the animosity? And why towards France and not other countries? The answer lies in Niger's history. In fact, the history of West Africa. This region was colonized by France from the late 19th century. They became independent after the Second World War. But unlike other colonizers, France never left. Their influence and presence continued to linger. Why is that? Time for a flashback. Let's begin from the 16th century. That's when France became interested in Africa. The reason was slaves. The French were the third biggest slave traders. They took around 1.3 million Africans to their colonies in the Americas. Around 200,000 people never made it. They perished at sea. As the slave trade developed, France needed ports. They got one in 1659 here in Saint Louis in Senegal. For a long time, French interests were limited to coastal Africa. The interiors were untouched. But in the 19th century, that changed. There were two reasons for that. One was the domestic rivalry back home. The European powers were already competing with each other. Africa became a new theatre. And reason number two was resources. Europe needed to feed its expanding industries. They zeroed in on this area. It was called the Gold Coast. There was gold, oil, and much more there. The French expansion began from Senegal. In 1854, General Louis Faidherbe was appointed governor. He quickly got down to business. Under his rule, French control was extended to Gambia. But his ambitions were bigger. He wanted to conquer the Niger Delta and Mali. His government was not so keen, though. They thought it would be too expensive, so the expansion project was paused. It would resume in the 1880s. This was the beginning of the scramble for Africa. No shadow wars anymore. European armies were marching across the continent. They were picking off countries one by one. This inevitably led to fighting between European powers, so the German Chancellor proposed a plan. This man, Otto von Bismarck. He brought all the European countries together in Berlin. In 1885, these countries signed the Berlin Act. It formalized the scramble for Africa, and the logic was quite simple. Instead of fighting each other, let's carve up the continent. Each country gets its own colony. And no, the Africans were not consulted. In the 1880s, almost 80% of the continent was ruled by the locals, kings, sultans, and tribal chiefs. By 1900, it was flipped. Around 90% of Africa was colonized by Europe, and Niger was part of this. In 1899, two French officers were put on the job. Captain Paul Vollet would lead this mission, and his second in command was Julien Chanoine. Both men had one thing in common: their bloodlust. They set off from Dakar in Senegal. Their job was this: explore Chad and Niger, gather local intelligence, reach the Sudan, and return. Basically, create this ribbon of French territory, from Senegal in the west to the Sudan in the east. Captain Vollet had a reputation. He led the French conquest of Burkina Faso in 1896. He was ambitious and brutal. His expedition to the Sudan is called many things: the Killer Trail, the African Apocalypse, the Heart of Darkness. Gives you an idea of what went down. It was one of the most violent and bloody episodes in colonial history, not just in Africa, but the whole world. Vollet's mission was not well funded, so at the first village he reached, he demanded porters. He needed people to carry things. When the locals denied, he razed the entire village. Around 100 people wiped out. It was a sign of things to come. Vollet often refused to feed his camp followers. When they complained, he killed them. Men, women, and children were bayoneted to death. Not shot, bayoneted, because Vollet wanted to save bullets. Such massacres followed him everywhere. It was so bad that word reached the French government in Paris. Vollet's own soldiers were horrified by the violence. Some of them deserted. When Paris got to know, they ordered Vollet and Chanoine to be arrested. They deputed a French officer from Mali. He followed the expedition's trail